you'll realize pretty quickly, I think, that we're a week behind the syllabus due to the snow day that we had a few weeks back. So if you're following along with the syllabus, this is the 5th lesson, not the 6th, that was initially planned for today's date. So we've been looking at, up to this point, Paul's life, his conversion, his early Christianity, and then we looked at the first and second missionary journeys. And tonight we're going to do a little bit more of what I had initially intended for this class to be in the first place, and that is more of a look at the context of the actual letters that Paul wrote than a survey of Paul's career as a preacher. But I felt like that it was necessary for us to get to this point to sort of survey his career and the development of his life, because there's so much of that background that informs what we read in the books. Now, it's my intention to take tonight and the next time we study together and look at the Corinthian letters, in part because there's a lot of material to be covered, and I couldn't cover it all in one lesson because, well, you know me. And also in part because I am about 98% convinced that there were at least 4 letters to the Corinthians, only 2 of which are preserved for us by divine providence. And so tonight, hopefully, we will discuss that, and then, Lord willing, the next time we study together, we'll get to do some things that are a little bit more specific to the content of the books and how they reflect the cultural, historical, geographical background of the people to whom Paul is writing and the times in which Paul is writing. All right, so let's dive in and look at part 1 of the Corinthian letters. And the first thing I want you to notice is the geographical situation of the city of Corinth. If you were with us in our study, the last group of studies that we did, sort of coming up to the end of last year, we talked in some detail about the history of the Greek culture because it informed our study of the intertestamental period. And one of the things that we touched on was the Peloponnesian Wars and the Greek wars with the Persians, because all of those had a bearing on the development of things in Palestine that lead to the New Testament. Well, the Peloponnesian Wars and the Persian Wars between the Persians and the Greeks, Corinth figures very largely in those. And primarily it figures largely because of its geographical situation. If you look on the map, you'll see that Corinth is sort of highlighted there. And geographically speaking, it is almost exactly halfway between what were historically the 2 great rival cities of Athens and Sparta. Furthermore, Corinth is located about midway of an isthmus that is at its narrowest point only about 4 miles wide, which means that it was virtually impossible to travel from Sparta to Athens or back without going within the very near vicinity of the city of Corinth. Of course, the great problem for the Corinthians was the fact that Sparta and Athens were perennially at war for much of ancient history. And so here they are, geographically located exactly between the 2 cities and located on an isthmus so that neither army could really go around Corinth to get to the other. They were pretty much always marching through Corinth, which means Corinth has strategic significance for both cities. And if either of them could control Corinth, of course, they could control the approach of their enemy. Furthermore, Corinth, as you will notice, it's very close to the sea on both sides. To the southeast, you have the Aegean Sea, which is the entire eastern coast of the Greek peninsula, and of course the western coast of Asia Minor, and that sea empties out into the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore gives you access to Palestine, gives you access to Egypt, the northern coast of Africa, all of those sorts of things. To the north and west, you have access to the Ionian Sea. The Ionian Sea is the sea that separates the Greek peninsula from the Italian peninsula, which means you have Rome to the west, and this is the direction that Rome would be approaching when they came by sea. Not only that, of course there's naval significance there. When the navies of the Greeks and the navies of the Romans are involved, the port at Corinth is of vital importance. But scratch military history for a moment, and let's just think about it from the point of view of commerce. If you're bringing things from Italy and the western part of Europe, and you're headed east, say for example to the Phoenician port cities, Tyre and Sidon and the other Phoenician port cities, and your intention is to sell your wares to the Phoenicians or to traveling merchants that were traveling that land trade route that came from the Far East through Mesopotamia, up and over the Fertile Crescent, down through Palestine and ended up in Egypt, you would have to deal with either sailing around the southern coast of Achaia, which was about a 400-mile detour, or you could put in port, if you're coming from the Ionian Sea, at Corinth, have your wares transported across land some 4 miles or so, and loaded onto another ship and sail east from there, which was what often happened. In fact, there was a tramway built for the purpose of moving bulk goods and even small vessels across the land from the Ionian port to the Aegean port. And so that makes Corinth, of course, a sort of nautical crossroads between the two seas that will save a long sail around the southern tip of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And so it has vital importance in terms of commerce. And it connects by land those two great cities of Sparta and Athens, so it has vital importance by virtue of land. And as you might imagine, Corinth became quite wealthy and became quite important. It never was a ruling city during ancient history. Athens and Sparta traded that back and forth, and some of the northern Mesopotamian cities, Macedonian cities did that as well. But Corinth was always important, it was always wealthy, and it was also known in ancient times for being morally quite loose. Okay? Now, I want to limit that statement just a little bit. The famous quote that is so often attributed to Corinth was from Homer, referring to Corinth as wealthy Corinth and using the term Corinthian as an epithet that sort of meant licentious, loose morals, that sort of thing. That's true enough. But historically speaking, Homer would have lived roughly contemporary with the prophet Isaiah in the 7th century BCE. The city that Homer wrote about did not exist when Paul was living. Oh, there was a city by that name, but it was not the same Corinth that Homer wrote about. And the reason I say that is because in 146 BCE, Rome destroyed the city of Corinth. That was a part of the Roman campaign to take control of the Greek peninsula. And as a matter of fact, the Battle of Corinth was the decisive battle that gave the Romans control of the Greek peninsula and allowed Rome to advance across Greece and into Asia Minor and begin to assert Roman dominance farther east. In fact, it was an immediate precursor to Roman domination coming to Palestine. Okay? And so when Rome destroyed Corinth in 146, when I say destroyed, they literally destroyed it, razed it to the ground, burned it, destroyed the buildings, and it was essentially more or less uninhabited for almost a century. Oh, there were some people that lived there, but it was not a city. Nothing like what it had once been until about 44 BCE. Now, does anybody happen to have a little alarm go off in your head when we say the year 44 BCE? There was something very important that happened that year. A couple of you are going, wait a minute, loading.
Big anniversary. 3 days from now?
As a matter of fact, it is. I'm glad you pointed that out. If you didn't hear Greg, he said the anniversary is 3 days from now. And if I were to say the phrase, beware the Ides of March, would that jog anyone's memory? What was it? The assassination of Julius Caesar. March 15th, the year 44 BCE. Well, just a little earlier that year, Julius established a new city of Corinth. In fact, he literally named it the Corinthian colony for the praise of Julius Caesar. And then he was promptly assassinated a few months later. However, the colony remained. And not only did the colony remain, but the Roman rulers saw the strategic importance and the commercial importance of this place. And they also saw that it gave them a very convenient way to avoid having to either sanction Athens or sanction Sparta, and thereby give either one of these factious groups a sort of a foot in the door to say, hey, we control Greece. Instead, they made the capital of Achaia Corinth. And they seated the Roman proconsul of Achaia in Corinth. And so that becomes very important. And that happens in 44 BCE. Paul is going to travel there, as we saw on the second missionary journey, sometime around 51 CE. So just a little over 100 years later, Paul comes to the new city of Corinth that has been built not by the ancient Greeks, but by the Romans. And Corinth, to be on Greek soil, had a distinctly Roman flavor at this point. Not only because it was a seat of Roman government, but it was also, as best we can tell from the ancient writers, very much a seat of the ancient Roman imperial cult. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the emperors of Rome demanded many of them to be worshipped as a god. And so the idea of Roman loyalty as a citizen came to be tangled up in the idea of being willing to hail the Caesar as God. And so that Roman imperial cult comes to be very important in Corinth. It may very well be that, and we'll talk more about this next week, that the presence of the Roman imperial cult in Corinth has a lot to do with what Paul describes as the present distress in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll talk more about that. But it would not be difficult to imagine the Corinthian Christians suffering greatly at the hands of the Romans by virtue of the presence of that Roman imperial cult. Now, I say it had a distinctly Roman flavor, and it did, but it was certainly not devoid of Greek flavor. And there were and had been from ancient times Greek underpinnings of the culture there. And there was known even in Paul's time to have been a temple to Aphrodite there in the city of Corinth. And very likely that temple to Aphrodite may involve some of the background of some of the things that Paul will say in the 1 Corinthian letter. The temple of Aphrodite, if you will recall from your Greek mythology, was, among other things, the goddess of love. And so the temple of Aphrodite involved a lot of sexual activity, and the priestesses of the temple of Aphrodite were little more than prostitutes. And so this is part of the culture. Not only that, but you have to keep in mind Corinth is not only a seaport city, but a double seaport city. Seaport cities have never been known in history to be especially high on the moral scale by virtue of the people who come and go through those seaport cities. And so there was certainly in Paul's day as well, although it's probably not fair to attribute Homer's description of Corinth to the Corinth that Paul dealt with, it's nevertheless probably not difficult to imagine that Corinth had seen its fair share of debauchery. And so there's a flavor of this in the letters that Paul writes to the Corinthians. All right. Now, as we mentioned, you have this new city that's just a little over 100 years old, and it is the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, and the site of the Roman imperial cult, the seat of the Roman proconsul, and it is a very wealthy city. Now, let's take a look as best we can at sort of the view from Corinth. I have not been to Corinth. I want to go. It's on my list. But I'm told that on a clear day, you can stand in Corinth and look to the northeast, and you can see the the Acropolis of Athens on the horizon, 44, 45 miles away. That's interesting. And when you consider that Sparta is roughly an equal distance to the southwest, you begin to get a picture of this place that's Corinth, and you can sort of see in this illustration the narrowness of the isthmus on which it is located. When, for example, Dr. Luke talks about Paul putting in Cenchrea, Cenchrea is just the port of Corinth. Yes, there was a settlement there, but it would have been sort of like going from Bemis to Jackson. If you can identify without a sign somewhere where the line is between Bemis and Jackson, that'd be about how easy it would be to identify the border between Cenchrea and Corinth. It was just sort of one homogeneous settlement. And so you have these ports here in the sea, and you've got this narrow stretch of land. Now, let's talk for a little bit about Paul's actual dealings with the Corinthians. And I want to explain to you why I say that I believe there were probably as many as 4 letters. Okay? First of all, we know from Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18, that Paul came to Corinth near the end of the second missionary journey, probably around 51, 52 CE. And he comes there and he spends a pretty significant period of time preaching and teaching there. He writes the Thessalonian letters from there, as we talked about last week. But let's just look at Acts chapter 18 for just a moment. If you have your Bibles, turn there with me. And let's begin reading in verse 1, Acts 18. After these events, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Let's pause there just a moment. Claudius then would have been the emperor on the throne in Rome. And you can go back and check out the history of Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome, but here are 2 Jews who are now in Corinth, having been expelled from the city of Rome, probably having seen it as safer to leave the entire Italian peninsula, and we just have to speculate on this, but it would make sense that they would have boarded a ship on the western coast of Italy, sailed across the Ionian Sea, and come into port here at Corinth. But at any rate, Paul encounters this man and his wife, and he came to them. And verse 3, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together, for they were tent makers by trade. And Paul was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, let's pause there just a moment. Paul comes to Priscilla and Aquila and he begins to work with them. And Luke lets us in on a little something about Paul's background that up to this point we don't know. He had somewhere learned the trade of tent making. I think I mentioned in an earlier class that I suppose that his father would have probably taught him that, and it probably would have been the family trade. But here are 2 other tent makers, and so they work together, and Paul is working in the tent making trade. Why would he do that? Well, he would do it to support himself. As a matter of fact, he made a point in some of the Corinthian writings to say that he did not accept support from the Corinthian Christians because he was worried that if he did so, people would use that as a grounds for saying Paul was just preaching what he did for the sake of profit and not out of pure motives. So here he is supporting himself in tent making until Silas and Timothy come down from Macedonia. And then he stops and he devotes himself completely to the Word. Why is it that Silas and Timothy's comings allows him to stop working as a tent maker and spend his full time preaching. I'm going to suggest to you that maybe what happened here, since they're coming from Macedonia, is that they brought with them a contribution from some of the Macedonian churches that Paul could now use to fund his living while he worked full-time preaching. We know, for example, that Paul wrote to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 4 and said that the Philippians had twice sent contributions to him. And so maybe that's what's going on here, that he has received a contribution that allows him to stop working to support himself and live off of the support from this gift, and he devotes himself entirely to the Word. Now watch what happens when he does this. Testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood is on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, as they listened to Paul, were believing and being baptized. Isn't it interesting throughout the book of Acts that whenever the gospel is preached, the result is people believe it and they're baptized? I mean, we could just point out example after example after example, and Luke mentions this here almost incidentally, but I think that the Lord is trying to give us here a pattern of what people are doing to be saved. But that being said, verse 9, the Lord said to Paul by a vision at night, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there for 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man is inciting the people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of some crime or vicious, unscrupulous act, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about teachings and persons of your own law, see to it yourself. I am unwilling to be a judge in these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. But they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. And yet Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. So remember, we mentioned that the Roman proconsul of the province of Achaia sits there in the city of Corinth. History seems to indicate that it was around 51 or 52, and in the summer, late spring of that year, that Gallio was seated as proconsul. Interestingly enough, if you're a history buff, a student of Roman history, Gallio's brother was a man by the name of Seneca, who you might have heard of. Very famous Stoic philosopher and statesman of the Roman Empire at this point. Gallio is his brother. He becomes the proconsul, and the Jews try to drag Paul and accuse him before the Roman proconsul. The proconsul says, "This is not my jurisdiction." Some of the commentators have indicated that when Gallio drove the Jews away, the leader of the synagogue wouldn't go, Sosthenes. He refused to go, and that was the reason for him being beaten before the judgment seat. Not sure about that. But at any rate, that's the background of Paul in Corinth, and he remains many days longer, and he works with the Corinthians. He establishes that church. All right? Then we have what we have as the first letter to the Corinthians. However, the first letter to the Corinthians itself, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 11, mentions a letter that Paul had already previously written. "I wrote in my letter for you not to keep company with fornicators." Remember that? Well, what letter would that be? We don't have it. It's clear from the context that that was a letter that Paul had written to the Corinthians before the letter that we have as 1 Corinthians. Which would mean, if we're counting the number of letters that we know of, our 1 Corinthians is really 2 Corinthians, right? And 1 Corinthians we don't have preserved for us. Now, before you get anxious and upset about that, this is by far not the only letter that we don't have that we know of. For example, in the letter to the Colossians, Paul mentions a letter that he wrote to the church in Laodicea. We don't have that one either. And it's almost certain that he wrote many other letters as well that we don't have preserved for us. I do know this. Peter tells us that God has given to us all things that pertain unto life and godliness. And Paul himself wrote to Timothy and said that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect or full grown and thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So what we have is sufficient. And we need not lose too much sleep over the letters we don't have. The Holy Spirit, evidently through the providence of God, preserved for us what God knew that we needed, and what else may be out there, we don't have to be afraid that we're missing something important. But at any rate, he writes this previous letter. And then in the letter, the first letter as we have it to the Corinthians, he mentions the fact, Paul does, that he received a report from Chloe's household. Remember this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he talks about the fact that he's received a report from Chloe's household that there are divisions among the Corinthians. And he says, I partly believe it. And he says, I'm hearing that some are saying, I'm of Paul, and others I'm of Apollos, and others I'm of Cephas, and others I'm of Christ. And he takes them to task for that. Well, somebody had come to him and told him that. And that raises the question, where and when did they come to him? There are several little clues in the Corinthian letters that lead us to believe that they came to Paul during his third missionary journey, which was from about 53 to 58 CE, and in particular, probably during the 2+ years of that journey when he resided in and worked in Ephesus. I'll explain that a little bit farther later on. But for the moment, suffice it to say that Paul is probably working in Ephesus. Now think about geographically, I should have given you a map, but think about geographically where Ephesus is. Ephesus is pretty near the western coast of Asia Minor, which means it's right across the Aegean Sea from Corinth. It wouldn't be a major ordeal at all for someone from Ephesus to board a ship, sail across the Aegean, land in Corinth, and talk to the Corinthians, and then come back and give Paul a report, or vice versa. And so Paul receives this report from Chloe's household, and also at the end of the 1 Corinthian letter, he mentions that a delegation has come to him, and he names certain individuals, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, who have come to him from Corinth, and it appears that they have brought with them, a letter from the Corinthian church. Now, of course, I'm inferring things from what Paul writes. But have you noticed when you read the 1 Corinthian letter that throughout that letter, Paul will often say, now concerning, and then he'll introduce a new topic, and he'll deal with that for a while, and then he'll say, now concerning, and he'll introduce another topic? It sounds an awful lot like what Paul is doing is answering questions that have been put to him. And so what I'm postulating here is that this delegation of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus bring with them a letter from the Corinthian church asking Paul certain questions that the church is grappling with, and he writes back to them. The letter we have is 1 Corinthians, responding to many of their questions. All right? So that would be what we have as 1 Corinthians. Then in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 14, and again in chapter 13 verses 1 and 2, Paul alludes to another visit that he made to Corinth. In fact, in chapter 13, he's preparing to visit them again, and he says, this is now the third time that I'm coming to you. Well, we know about the first time in Acts chapter 18, but we don't have any independent record of the second visit. Luke simply doesn't give that to us. And so we sort of have to conclude that probably Paul made a brief visit while he was on that third missionary journey that Luke doesn't record for whatever reason. Okay? He describes it as a painful visit. Things did not go well during that visit, and Paul is not happy. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 4, Paul describes a letter that he has written with many tears. And so some have called that the sorrowful letter or the tearful letter. Now, there's a great deal of argumentation between the scholars over that. Is the sorrowful letter the letter that we have as 1 Corinthians? I personally am of the view that it's not, for a couple of reasons. Paul certainly takes issue with some of the things the Corinthians are doing in 1 Corinthians, and at times he's quite strident in the way that he deals with them. But he doesn't appear to be distraught. He appears to be dealing with them as a teacher who is correcting students who have gone astray in various ways and teaching them better. However, it does sort of seem to make sense that he makes this painful visit. Something happens while he's there. He encounters certain opponents, and he spends a lot of the 2 Corinthian letter, as we have it, dealing with opponents. And he comes back and he writes another letter that we don't have preserved for us. If that's true, that would be what we might call 3 Corinthians. Okay? Again, if the scholars are who believe that that is 1 Corinthians are right, then there would only be 3 letters to the Corinthians. I'm of the view there were 4. Then we have in the book of 2 Corinthians reference that Titus comes to Paul while he is in Ephesus with a good report from Corinth. Now, this is just an aside. But when you read about Timothy and Titus, of course, both of these men are proteges of Paul's. But when you read about what they did and how Paul utilized their particular talents, I would argue that there's probably a marked difference in personality between these two men. Timothy, from the things that Paul writes, seems to be very tender-hearted, to be a man who can be at times a little less than fully confident in his own abilities. And so Paul often spends time in his writings to Timothy trying to bolster his confidence and help him to be strong. Titus, on the other hand, seems to get all the tough assignments. Paul sends Titus wherever there's trouble and basically sends him there as a troubleshooter and a head knocker. I mean, when you read the letter to Titus, he sent him down to Crete where he said there's nothing down there but evil sluggards and slow bellies. And I sent you down there to set them straight. And so evidently Titus is a man who can be quite strong and can be very forthright and can correct things in a way that's suitable. Well, Titus is the one who's over at Corinth. That sort of fits the pattern, doesn't it? If Paul's been to Corinth, he's encountered opposition. He's very sorrowful over it. He writes them a sorrowful letter. Perhaps he sends that sorrowful letter by the hand of Titus. That also wouldn't be uncommon for Paul. And Titus does some head knocking in Corinth and comes back and gives a good report to Paul. And Paul then writes the letter we have as 2 Corinthians, where, among other things, he is rejoicing over the restoration of someone who had previously been in the wrong. And he is comforting the Corinthians and he commends them. At times he takes issue with the enemies that are still there. He reminds them of their commitment to a particular collection that was going on. But it seems to me that what we have are 4 letters. Now, if you disagree with me on that, I will not fall out of fellowship with you. I might chide you just a little bit and tell you you're okay being wrong if you want to. No, I'm just kidding. We're inferring a lot here. I understand that. But I do believe that the pattern of 4 letters and 3 visits altogether, 2 of which precede 2 Corinthians, help us to put together a sequence of events that then help some of the things that Paul says in the letters to make more sense. Do you have questions or comments on any of that? Yes, sir, Greg.
This is the question from chapter 18 of Acts.
Okay.
In verse 8, we're told Crispus, ruler of the synagogue, believed together with his entire household. Later, there's another, right? Sosthenes is this other person, I guess 8 verses later.
That's right, verse 17.
Referred to as ruler of the synagogue. Is it the same man or 2 different individuals?
Great question. So Greg's question, if you didn't hear it, was in Acts chapter 18 and verse 8, Crispus is identified as the leader of the synagogue, and then about 11 verses later in chapter 17, it says they took hold of Sosthenes, who was the ruler or the leader of the synagogue. And his question is, are these two different individuals? Are they the same person? Here's my judgment. Crispus in verse 6 is said to have believed on the Lord with his house and to have consorted with Paul when he leaves the synagogue. Now, the way that Paul left the synagogue in Corinth greatly angered the establishment Jews, because he said, I'm going to the Gentiles. That was an anathema statement to the establishment Jews. Okay? They are deeply angered. That's what ultimately persuades them to drag him before Gallio. Okay? I'm going to argue that what happened was Crispus was more or less excommunicated from the synagogue by virtue of following Paul when he left to go work with the Gentiles, and replaced by this Sosthenes. And if we're right in what I mentioned earlier, that some of the commentators indicate that they believe what happened here is Gallio said to the Jews, I'm not hearing this complaint, you are dismissed, please go. Sosthenes may have stayed behind and pressed the point after he had been dismissed, and that's what led to his getting beaten before the judgment seat of Gallio. I will say this. Gallio is acting here in a judicial function. Gallio is also known in history as being a very even-tempered and congenial sort of a fellow. It's interesting that there's no reference here to Gallio commanding him to be beaten. However, Gallio, as it were, is said to have turned sort of a blind eye to the beating of Sosthenes. I'm going to argue here that what happened is essentially the Roman soldiers who were acting as bailiffs in this court proceeding stepped in and said, sir, you have been excused, and he didn't want to go, and so they beat him, as Roman soldiers were allowed to do. I will say this from my own experiences as an attorney. In the courtroom, when the judge signals to you that he's heard all of your argument he wants to hear and you may be excused, it's right intelligent to go ahead and gather your things and leave. Nothing good happens if you stay and press the point, as quite a few lawyers who have spent the night in jail or paid a $50 fine for contempt of court have learned to their own chagrin. Sosthenes learned it at the end of a beating. That's my judgment. It's a good question, Greg. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
It was saying that he told them not to deal with the idolaters and the sexual people. Isn't that what they're supposed to be doing, to pull those people to be Christianity? It's not just, we're not going to talk to these guys. You can't talk to them.
That is a magnificent question. CT's question is, weren't the Corinthians supposed to be trying to convert the idolaters and immoral and things of that nature? And his reference there is to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, referring back to his previous letter. I will say this very briefly, and then I will give you a more detailed explanation next week since we're almost out of time. Very briefly, it seems in 1 Corinthians 5 that Paul is essentially saying that the Corinthians misunderstood his meaning in that letter, and he's further instructing them as to what he did mean. But also, I would say that what he's talking about there is having fellowship with fellow Christians who are sinning in those particular ways contrary to the faith, rather than having to do with non-Christians whom you're trying to teach. Okay? Hope that helps, and like I say, we'll deal with that in more detail next week. It's a great question. All right, thank you so much for your attention.